Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and unearth the most compelling insights, making complex ideas accessible and incredibly relevant to your life. Today, we're diving headfirst into a truly profound topic, existentialism. Now, forget the stereotypical image. The beret-wearing intellectual in a smoky Parisian cafe, though, yeah, that era is certainly part of its story. Our mission today is to go beyond that cultural phenomenon and truly unpack the philosophical core of existentialist thought. We want to reveal its enduring power and surprising applications to how you live and understand your world.
Exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is Thomas Flynn's Existentialism, a very short introduction. This text provides a really meticulously structured overview. It covers the foundational themes, the key thinkers, and, well, the profound questions existentialism raises about human existence itself. We'll be extracting the core ideas and the philosophical debates, focusing not just on what these concepts are, but really the why and how these directly shape our understanding of ourselves and, our place in the world. It's a dense read, no doubt, but an incredibly rewarding journey through some of the most impactful ideas, really, of the last century and even before.
So get ready to explore what it means to truly exist, to grapple with freedom, responsibility, the search for meaning, all without getting lost in jargon. We're talking about a way of doing philosophy that isn't just abstract theory, but more like a blueprint for living a thoughtful, engaged life. This deep dive is for you, whether you're prepping for a meeting on human behavior, catching up on philosophy, or just, insanely curious about what makes us fundamentally human. Okay, let's unpack this. Okay, so to really grasp existentialism, I think we first have to understand its deep roots. It goes way back to this ancient tradition of philosophy, one that sees philosophy not as some abstract academic thing, but as a practical, vital guide for how to live. What are we talking about here?
Precisely. Yeah, existentialism, despite its kind of 20th century fame, it draws heavily from what the Greeks called epimeleia houtou, which translates roughly to care of the self. And this isn't about navel-gazing, not at all. It's about focusing on how one acts, how one conducts their life, rather than merely, accumulating a set of theoretical truths. It's about personal transformation, making philosophy a lived experience.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Think of Socrates. He wasn't just teaching abstract ideas in some ancient equivalent of a classroom. His entire life was his philosophy. I remember reading that the Athenian general Laches was so impressed by Socrates, not just for his words, but for the profound harmony between his teaching and his actual life. Socrates saw himself less as a doctor of the body, more like a doctor of the soul, right? Prescribing attitudes and practices designed to foster genuine health and happiness within. Didn't he even warn the court at his trial that they wouldn't easily find another like him? Someone to urge them to care for themselves above all.
He did, yes. And this care of the self approach, it really flourished in the Hellenistic period, particularly among the Stoics and the Epicureans. They were intensely focused on ethical questions, the proper way to live. But over time, philosophy took a different turn. It became increasingly geared towards, the pursuit of abstract truths about human nature, the universe, eventually leading to the rise of modern science. Theory became almost synonymous with philosophy itself, and the practical application of wisdom to one's life, it got marginalized. The scientific model of truth, where knowledge makes no demands on the kind of person you are to understand it. Descartes thought a sinner could grasp a mathematical formula just as well as a saint. That model took precedence.
So this idea of moral truth, which demanded self-discipline like diet control, careful speech, meditation even, to truly access, that was really sidelined. It moved into the domains of spiritual direction or maybe psychology, rather than being central to philosophy.
Exactly. It wasn't seen as core philosophy anymore, but that's not to say the ancient tradition disappeared entirely. Works like St. Augustine's Confessions, Pascal's Pensées, they kept this more personal, self-formative understanding of philosophy alive, and it's within this larger ancient tradition of philosophy as a way of life that existentialism finds its authentic place. It revives this deeply personal notion of truth, a truth that has to be lived.
The profound insight here, I think, is that philosophy isn't just about clever ideas, it's a living practice. Which means you don't necessarily need a fancy degree to engage with it. Like if you're trying to integrate more mindfulness into your day or live more intentionally, you're already doing this, aren't you? This ancient care of the self.
Yeah.
It's about aligning your actions with your values, making your life itself a kind of philosophical statement.
And this commitment to live truth is absolutely crucial. The 19th century figures we often call the fathers of existentialism, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they both had incredibly ambivalent attitudes towards Socrates. They saw him as both a defender of universal reason, which Kierkegaard often praised, but Nietzsche famously censured, and as this incredible exemplar of an individuating leap beyond pure rationality. Like when Socrates accepted his death sentence, it wasn't based on irrefutable proof, was it? It was based on the possibility of an immortal soul. This highlights the idea of a personal conviction, something you're willing to risk your life for. It's a truth that demands everything.
And that leads directly, doesn't it, right into Kierkegaard. His whole idea of truth as subjectivity. He argued that objective reflection just leads to abstract thought, where the subject becomes, infinitely indifferent. But subjective reflection, for Kierkegaard, that's a deeply personal conviction. He said, the thing is to find a truth which is true for me, to find the idea for which I can live and die. So it's about appropriation, right? Making a truth your own, internalizing it, rather than just approximation to some objective, detached fact. The emphasis is entirely on the how you believe the passion, the commitment, not just the what. It's a decisive turn, an existential choice. Okay, so moving into the 19th and early 20th centuries, you had positivism really taking hold. This idea that only the quantifiable yields reliable knowledge, aiming for this impersonal view from nowhere. But I mean, what does this do to the big unquantifiable questions? The questions of life, ethics, meaning that we all grapple with.
Well, positivism, with its insistence on objective, measurable facts, it kind of inadvertently created a significant blind spot. The very choice to limit what counts as knowable to what is quantifiable. That choice itself is a non-quantifiable value judgment. It's a leap of faith, you could say. This self-contradiction leaves crucial ethical questions unanswered, or maybe deemed unanswerable, like the intrinsic value of preventing gratuitous pain. Bertrand Russell, who was hardly an existentialist, he couldn't believe that our revulsion at pain was just a subjective preference. It points to a need to revise our definition of objectivity, doesn't it? To expand what true means.
And this brings us back to the individual in a new way then. If our own perceptions and values are just dismissed as subjective, what happens to how we understand the world?
Exactly. Sartre pointed out that the only theory of knowledge that can be valid today is one which is founded on that truth of microphysics. The experimenter is part of the experimental system. He's alluding, of course, to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The act of observation affects the observed. Flynn uses the example of an ethnologist studying a so-called primitive tribe. The very act of their intervention changes the tribe. You can't get a pristine observation. This radically challenged those positivist and rationalist notions of a clear, exhaustive, entirely objective reality. It suggested our interaction is always part of what we know.
It's like thinking about light. Is it a wave or a particle? It seems to be both, but neither exclusively. This challenges standard either logic, doesn't it? It calls for a new way to make sense of phenomena, one that acknowledges ambiguity, complexity, which sort of paves the way for existentialist thought to consider human experience in a similar, nuanced way.
And the key insight here, I think, is that pure objectivity is often an illusion, especially when it comes to human experience. Every observation, every interpretation, it's filtered through your perspective, your values, your history. This means when you encounter conflicting information or different viewpoints, recognizing your own pre-understanding, as hermeneutics calls it, allows for deeper, more honest engagement. You're not just a passive receiver of facts, you're an active participant in constructing meaning.
That emphasis on integrating the subject, it really transforms how we even think about things we usually consider fixed, like space and time. Existentialists personalize these. How does that work?
Absolutely. Unlike measurable clock time, they introduce concepts like ecstatic temporality. This means the meaning and value of time's dimensions, the already, the past, the not yet, the future, and the present, our immersion in the everyday. These are functions of our attitudes and choices. Our lived time is intensely qualitative, not just quantitative.
And we all experience this, right? Time flies when you're having fun, drags when you're in pain or bored. Camus' The Plague has that vivid description of characters in quarantine, hostile to the past, impatient of the present, and cheated of the future. It's like prisoners doing time. Sartre even describes someone literally jumping for joy as a way of using their body to kind of magically conjure up a desired situation all at once. It's this immediate bodily expression of lived time, wanting to compress pleasure into a single moment.
Exactly. And similarly, existential space is deeply personalized. Sartre cites Kurt Lewin's idea of tautological space, our lived space. Think about the familiar habitual route you take to work, or what we call our comfort zone. It's not about objective measurements, maps, or coordinates. It's about how our own life project, our choices, our intentions, order our meaningful spaces. How you arrange your desk, even how close or far you stand from someone in conversation. These are all expressions of your lived space, imbued with your intentions and projects.
What's crucial here, though, is that these aren't just psychological quirks, are they? For existentialists, they have profound ontological significance. They articulate our very ways of existing. They place great importance on emotions like anguish, which Kierkegaard saw as our awareness of radical freedom, and nausea, Sartre's term for experiencing the sheer contingency of existence. This emphasis on emotion often puts them in direct dialogue with artists, doesn't it? Because these are the raw materials of creative expression.
Yes, and the insight for you here is that your subjective experience of time and space profoundly shapes your reality. Your perception isn't just a filter, it's a creative force. For instance, when you're facing a tight deadline, the hours don't just pass, they actively weigh on you, they feel different. Or when you feel at home somewhere new, it's not just about the physical place, but about how your choices and connections have transformed an objective location into your meaningful space. This shows you are an active creator of your experience, not just a passive inhabitant of a pre-given world.
What's fascinating here is how this dramatic nature, this respect for emotional consciousness, and the use of what Flynn calls indirect communication, it really invites association with art. Critics often try to dismiss existentialism as merely literary, just for novelists or playwrights. But its rigorous descriptions, its careful distinctions, its explicit engagement with the whole philosophical tradition that firmly identifies it as philosophical. It really beautifully blurs the line between conceptual analysis and imaginative expression, showing how the two can mutually enrich our understanding of existence. Hashtag 1.4. 5 core themes of existentialism.
Okay, so while there isn't a strict, rigid definition that fits every single thinker labeled existentialist, we can distill the movement, as Flynn does, into 5 core themes. These themes kind of crisscross and overlap among the various thinkers, forming what Wittgenstein might call a family resemblance.
Right. The first, and probably the most famous, is existence precedes essence. In plain terms, what you are, your identity, your purpose, your essence, it's not some pre-given destiny. Instead, it's the result of your choices and actions, your existence. You make yourself. So the insight here is that your essence is a continuous project authored by you. You're not stuck with a label, you redefine yourself with every choice. Think about someone who makes a radical career change midlife. They're actively creating a new essence.
Exactly. Secondly, time is of the essence. We are fundamentally time-bound beings. As we just discussed, lived time is qualitative. Its past, present, and future differ in meaning and value based on our choices and how we relate to them, the insight. Your past doesn't determine your future. It's a field of experience you interpret and use to shape what comes next. How you view past failures, for instance, is a choice impacting your present and future actions.
Thirdly, humanism. Existentialism is a profoundly person-centered philosophy. It's not anti-science, not at all, but its focus is squarely on the individual's pursuit of identity and meaning, often in defiance of those societal pressures for superficiality and conformity that are so prevalent, especially in modern mass society. It values the human above all else. The insight here is that this philosophy puts you at the center. It demands that you find your own values and meaning, rather than passively accepting what society dictates. It's about personal agency in a world that often tries to homogenize us.
Fourth, freedom and responsibility. Existentialism is undeniably a philosophy of freedom. It's rooted in the fact that we can step back from our lives, reflect on what we've been doing, and choose our path. In this sense, we are always more than ourselves, always transcending our given situation. But with this profound freedom comes an equally profound, maybe even terrifying responsibility for our choices and for the values we create through them, the insight. Your choices aren't trivial. They carry immense weight. Even inaction is a choice with consequences. Recognizing this can be daunting, sure, but it's also incredibly empowering. Your life is genuinely in your hands.
And finally, number 5, ethical considerations are paramount. Though each existentialist understands the ethical in their own unique way, the underlying concern across the board is to invite us to examine the authenticity of our personal lives and, crucially, of our society as a whole. It's about living truthfully with oneself and one's world. So the insight isn't just about following rules, but about living with integrity, where your inner convictions match your outer actions. This pursuit of authenticity can guide you in making decisions that truly reflect who you are and who you want to be. Okay, so given these themes, especially freedom and authenticity, it becomes clear that for existentialists, becoming an individual isn't just something that happens. It's a risky, hard-won achievement. What do you mean by that?
Absolutely. Existentialism is often labeled individualistic, and it is in a sense, but it posits that being an individual, especially in a mass society, is an achievement. It's not a starting point we're born with. Modern society, with its relentless pressures, media, advertising, social norms, constantly pulls us towards conformity, towards thinking and acting as they do, rather than from a deeply personal, authentic place.
And we see this idea echoed in different terms across the thinkers, right? Kierkegaard talks about the plebs or the crowd. Nietzsche talks about the herd. Heidegger has das Man, the they self. Sartre uses the one. They're all pointing to this phenomenon of living as they do, just following anonymous public opinion without critical reflection. Flynn mentions Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich, where the character constantly strives to behave comme il faut, properly, according to societal expectations. His whole life is a performance for others until he faces death.
Exactly. And Nietzsche vividly described the profound loneliness involved in rising above this herd, in forging one's own path. His own life was a tragic testament to this often suffering illness, self-publishing his works, which gained little traction during his lifetime. He famously wrote, "To live alone, one must be either a beast or a god," says Aristotle. Leaving out the third case, one must be both a philosopher. He championed those philosophers who dared to act against received wisdom, against the current of their age.
Kierkegaard really epitomized this struggle against conformity, didn't he? He launched these fierce attacks, these polemics, against the three most powerful forces in his Copenhagen: the popular press, for doing people's thinking for them; the state church, for doing their believing, turning Christianity into just culture; and Hegelian philosophy, for doing their choosing, sort of smoothing over difficult choices. These actions totally isolated him. Flynn mentions he even reportedly preferred that single individual as his epitaph. He was so committed to this singular, difficult calling that he notoriously broke his engagement to Regine Olsen, right? Believing he could inflict his painful, lonely vocation on her. His life was a testament to the price of nonconformity.
It really was. So the key insight here, I think, is that true individuality isn't automatic. It's a deliberate act of self-creation, often in defiance of societal pressures. This means that if you've ever felt that internal tension, the pull between doing what's expected and doing what feels genuinely right for you, then you're grappling with this core existential challenge. It's about finding your unique voice and purpose, even if it feels isolating or difficult at times. Hashtag 2.2, Kierkegaard's Stages on Life's Way.
So Kierkegaard's most detailed exploration of this project of becoming an individual is in works like Either Or and Stages on Life's Way. He uses these pseudonymous authors, these different characters and stories, to describe three spheres of existence, or stages: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. What's the point of this indirect communication style?
Well, it's a rhetorical strategy, really. It's designed to invite your personal involvement, to make you see the situations and test the morals of these stories on your own life, rather than just passively receiving abstract philosophical doctrines. He wants you to engage, to choose. One of his characters, Frater Taciturnus, summarizes these stages. The aesthetic is immediacy, living in the moment. The ethical is requirement, obligation so infinite, he says, it leads to a kind of bankruptcy. And the religious is a fulfillment, but it's a joyful contradiction, existing, as he puts it, out on 70,000 fathoms of water.
Okay, let's dive into the aesthetic stage first. This is this sphere of the immediate present, right? Indifferent to the past as repentance or the future as obligation, except maybe in a purely calculating way. Kierkegaard was fascinated by Mozart's Don Juan, the tireless seducer, living only for the sensual satisfaction of the moment. It's about living for fleeting experiences. So the insight is, living aesthetically means prioritizing immediate gratification and novelty, avoiding deep commitment. It's accumulating experiences without taking responsibility for their meaning. Like someone constantly chasing the next trend, the next trip, the next partner, always needing external stimulation.
Precisely. And the ultimate aesthete, in Kierkegaard's work, is Johannes the Seducer. In the Diary of a Seducer, Johannes strategically seduces this young woman, Cordelia. But he maneuvers her into breaking their engagement precisely to escape the ethical side of commitment, the binding part. He even remarks quite cynically, to poetize oneself into a young girl is an art. To poetize oneself out of her is a masterpiece. He lives for momentary conquest, sees it all as an artistic performance without regret. He's not interested in the messy, binding realities of real commitment. And that's exactly it. Johannes isn't immoral in the conventional sense. He's amoral. He simply doesn't play the ethical game. The rules of right and wrong don't apply in his sphere.
Okay, so the ethical stage introduces something fundamentally different then.
Yes. The ethical stage, by contrast, introduces concepts like repentance, obligation, and commitment. It's accessed via a leap of free choice, an individuating act where you commit yourself. Kierkegaard suggests, rather pessimistically perhaps, that most people live their entire lives stuck in the aesthetic stage, maybe incapable of the self-constituting choice required to become a true ethical self. So the insight, Moving to the ethical stage means embracing commitment and responsibility. It's choosing to live by a set of universal principles, even when it's hard. This is where you decide to be a reliable friend, a dedicated parent, an honest professional, not because it's always easy or fun, but because you've chosen to uphold certain values and define yourself through those commitments.
Judge William, another of Kierkegaard's characters, directly warns the aesthete, doesn't he? He warns about losing the unifying power of personality, becoming just a multiplicity, unable to truly love because there's no stable self to give. He emphasizes that choice is self-constituting and profoundly liberating. If you don't choose, you essentially lose yourself.
He uses a brilliant analogy. He compares life to a ship's captain who reaches a point, an instant, where a choice must be made. If the captain neglects to choose, then circumstances or others choose for him, and he loses his self, his command. Sartre echoes this strongly, asserting, "To exist is to choose, and to cease to choose is to cease to be." For human reality, to be is to choose oneself. It means our entire life is this ongoing choice, and even the failure to choose is itself a choice we're responsible for. The basic choice, Kierkegaard argues through the Judge, isn't even between good and evil initially. It's whether to enter the game where good and evil apply at all. It's a criterion constituting choice, like deciding to play chess and thereby accepting its rules.
But then comes the religious stage, which Kierkegaard presents as the highest form of individuation. This is another profound leap, a leap of faith this time. The operative categories here are sin and grace. And the prime example is Abraham, willing to sacrifice his son Isaac in response to a singular divine command. He thereby suspends the ethical right. From an ethical viewpoint, his intended act is immoral. He's beyond good and evil in a Nietzschean sense. He experiences the profound anguish of freedom, the terrifying risk that the command might not actually be divine. The individual here stands above the universal law, alone before God. So the insight here is, this stage transcends conventional morality. It demands a radical, maybe terrifying, personal commitment that might seem irrational to others. It's facing extreme paradoxes and making a choice that defines your deepest faith or conviction, even if it means sacrificing ethical norms for a higher personal calling, like someone dedicating their life to an unpopular cause, enduring scorn, driven by an unwavering internal conviction.
Exactly. And this Abraham story, with its unique ethical dilemma, it contributed significantly to what later became known as situation ethics, the idea that each ethical case is unique and maybe incomparable. Sartre's example of the young man in Nazi-occupied France, torn between caring for his mother and joining the Free French forces, captures this perfectly. Sartre's advice: you are free, therefore choose, that is to say, invent. There are no pre-given rules to solve that dilemma. It's an act of moral creativity fraught with perils, but also offering profound self-constitution. Abraham's act, Kierkegaard says, was a teleological suspension of the ethical, a temporary hold placed on universal ethics for a higher divine goal. But crucially, Abraham returns to the ethical sphere afterward, albeit now knowing its limits.
The Judge, back in the ethical sphere, warns against the dissipation of life stuck purely in the aesthetic, where one loses the ability to love because there's no self to give. He states, if you cannot reach the point of seeing the aesthetical, the ethical, and the religious as three great allies, then life is devoid of meaning, which implies a kind of synthesis or overlap, doesn't it? It complicates the strict either nature of the stages and highlights that existentialist comfort with ambiguity, recognizing that life rarely fits into neat categories. Hashtag 2.3, freedom, determinism, and fatalism.
Now, existentialism is fundamentally a philosophy of freedom, but what freedom means varies quite a bit among these thinkers. Nietzsche, for one, famously denied free will in the traditional sense. He attributed human action to the will to power, this cosmic, biological, psychological force driving all existence, not conscious choice. He's often called a master of suspicion for this, casting doubt on our stated reasons for actions, suggesting the true, often unconscious motives lie much deeper.
So, Nietzsche believed that our judgments of evil acts stem from this erroneous belief that the perpetrator could have acted otherwise. If we truly understood the underlying forces compelling them, he thought, then to understand all is to forgive all. That's quite a radical view, suggesting our moral indignation is often based on a misunderstanding of human nature. The insight here is, Nietzsche challenges us to look beyond surface intentions and question the real drives behind our actions and judgments. This can be insightful for understanding why we judge others, or why we find ourselves repeating certain patterns. Maybe there are deeper, non-rational wills at play than we consciously admit.
Yet, despite denying free will in that conventional sense, Nietzsche proposed a kind of higher ethic. This was for what he called free spirits, based on creating values after the death of God, meaning the decline of the Judeo-Christian God's authority in modern life. Man is an evaluating animal, he claimed. The task was to transform life into a work of art, combining noble moral and aesthetic values. He theorized this whole reversal of master morality, which was life-affirming, focused on noble versus ignoble, by slave morality, driven by resentment, this deep-seated resentment which inverted values to good and evil, praising things like humility and pity. Free spirits, according to Nietzsche, would re-reverse this inversion, embracing a life-affirming ethic once more, beyond the confines of conventional good and evil.
Nietzsche also proposed eternal recurrence, didn't he? This really challenging fatalism, where every moment, every choice, every event recurs infinitely. It challenges us to live each moment as if we'd be willing to relive it endlessly. His counsel was love of fate, amor fati, actively willing the past and present, not just passively resigning to it. This raises a fascinating paradox of freedom within fate, reminiscent of Kierkegaard's challenges to conventional thinking. The insight amor fati is about fully embracing everything in your life, even the suffering, as essential. Instead of wishing things were different, you actively will them to be, transforming passive acceptance into a powerful affirmation. Imagine reframing a past regret not as something to erase, but as a crucial part of your unique journey.
Interestingly, Kierkegaard's Judge William noted something similar regarding psychosocial conditioning. He warned of a danger that the next instant it may not be equally in my power to choose, end quote, as personality can choose unconsciously, or the choice is made by obscure powers within it. This sounds a bit like Nietzsche's instincts, doesn't it? Or what Sartre might later call a sedimentation of previous choices, end quote. But Flynn notes this can still preserve the autonomy of existential choice if seen as the accumulated result of prior actions, not external determinism.
Sartre, though, in his essay Cartesian Freedom, took Descartes' idea of the absolute freedom of the divine will and applied it directly to humans, especially in the absence of God. He argued that the entire world of meaning is our creation, for which we are without excuse. Unlike Nietzsche's free spirits, who seem almost genetically capable of appreciating life-affirming motives, Sartre focused on our universal capacity for creating moral values through creative choices. This freedom is available to everyone.
And then there's Karl Jaspers. Influenced by both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, he saw them as crucial exceptions, who philosophized in view of the exception without being an exception themselves. He believed they articulated an impending calamity, the modern devaluing of existence, the properly human way of being. They criticized overly systematic philosophies that tried to neatly categorize human existence. They appealed directly to the individual, serving as models of honesty and commitment. Not necessarily to be imitated in their extreme suffering, perhaps, but admired for their authenticity. Jasper's lesson was to philosophize in view of the exception without being an exception, to learn from the extremes without having to live them.
Okay, let's talk about humanism. In 1945, Sartre's lecture, Is Existentialism a Humanism? Basically became a manifesto, didn't it? It really solidified that phrase, existence precedes essence. Given his atheism, he argued individuals create their own values, and freedom itself is the ultimate value. He was trying to counter critics at the time, communists, Catholics who saw existentialism as just bourgeois individualism, insensitive to social justice issues.
Right. But as Flynn points out, this lecture was actually quite problematic for Sartre's own philosophy at the time. Sartre linked individual freedom to a kind of universal responsibility, declaring, "In choosing for myself, I choose for all people," which sounds very Kantian. He also stated that every action creates an image of man such as we judge he ought to be. These principles were sort of prescient for his later work, but they didn't logically follow from his major work, Being and Nothingness. He apparently came to regret publishing the lecture. Ironically, though, it became his most widely read philosophical work, massively shaping the public perception of existentialism.
So, for Sartre in that lecture, humanism is person-centered. It places the human at the apex of value. The ultimate goal is fostering individual freedom by enhancing the concrete possibilities of choice for everyone, never sacrificing individual freedom to abstract notions like class or God. When he says choose, that is invent, he means responsibly opting for or against freedom itself, creating value through choice, not just improvising randomly. The insight is, Sartre's humanism tells you that with every genuine choice, you're not just defining yourself, you're also subtly suggesting what humanity could or should be. This adds incredible weight, not just what do I want, but what kind of human action am I modeling? Hashtag 3.2. Camus and the Absurd.
Albert Camus agreed with Sartre that individuals create whatever meaning our world holds. But for Camus, this realization leads to anguish when we inevitably seek meaning from a fundamentally indifferent, silent universe. He famously called this clash the absurdity of the human condition, our profound longing for meaning colliding with the universe's utter silence on the matter.
And his solace, famously, comes from the myth of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to eternally push a boulder up a mountain, only for it to roll back down each time. Camus controversially claims Sisyphus is happy during that moment when he turns back down the mountain. Why? Because he has risen above his fate, not through resignation, but through deliberate choice and consciousness. He transforms the meaningless "it was" into the defiant "thus I willed it." It's about acknowledging there's no ultimate hope, but finding dignity and meaning in the struggle itself, limiting expectations like the Stoics, finding joy in the defiant act of pushing on, the insight from Camus. Even facing a meaningless universe, we can find joy and dignity in the conscious act of rebellion and choosing our attitude. This means you have the power to infuse your own meaning into repetitive or seemingly futile tasks simply by embracing them and defiantly affirming your own will. Hashtag 3.3.
Sartre's humanistic mantra really was, you can always make something out of what you've been made into. This commitment to freedom underlies his strong rejection of the Freudian unconscious. He believed it robbed us of freedom and responsibility by positing these deterministic, hidden drives. For Sartre, we are always free, radically free, to define ourselves anew.
But other existentialists weren't so quick to dismiss the non-conscious, were they? Kierkegaard's Judge William referenced unconscious choices. Nietzsche, with his focus on non-rational drives like the will to power, certainly anticipated Freud in some ways. Heidegger was apparently indifferent to psychoanalysis, but influenced it through thinkers like Binswanger. Merleau-Ponty respected Freud, seeing the unconscious more like an ambiguous perception, not a hidden entity. Jaspers, on the other hand, was quite critical of Freud, wasn't he? Worried he degraded self-examination into just a discovery of sexual longings, reducing man to a puppet of his unconscious.
Exactly. What's really at stake here is the kind of freedom an embodied, socially situated human being can realistically expect. This highlights a fundamental division among existentialists regarding the role of non-conscious factors in human action and just how much radical autonomy we truly possess. The insight for you is, this debate forces you to consider how much your past experiences or maybe subconscious drives genuinely influence your present. While no one denies external influences, the existentialist challenge is to recognize where your conscious choice and interpretation can still reshape your path, rather than passively accepting some predetermined fate. Hashtag 3.4, Heidegger's alternative humanism. Now, many of Heidegger's followers, and Heidegger himself later on, argued he wasn't really an existentialist in the same vein as Sartre. His primary interest, they'd say, was the meaning of being itself, capital B, not ethics or psychology per se. His fundamental question was, what does it mean to be? His later work became much more poetic, focusing on clearing away obstacles to let the being event happen.
Right. In his letter on humanism, Heidegger criticized traditional humanism's definition of man as simply a rational animal. He argued it sells man short, reducing our potential. He felt this definition led inevitably to a technological society that values only productivity and utility. And he felt Sartre, despite his focus on freedom, failed to escape this underlying metaphysics that privileges the calculating subject.
Heidegger's special term, Dasein, which just means the human way of being there, signifies humanity's unique openness to being. Our ability to kind of conserve a place for the being event. Dasein, for Heidegger, is the shepherd of being. We're meant to dwell poetically on earth, not just pragmatically exploit it. This, he claimed, was the true humanism, emphasizing a profound, almost reverential attunement to existence itself.
However, the early Heidegger, particularly in Being and Time, definitely utilized many concepts borrowed from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche that are clearly existential in flavor. Things like angst, existential anguish, ecstatic temporality, our lived experience of time passing, and especially being unto death, our unique relationship to our own mortality.
Yes, the realization and acceptance of our finitude, our being unto death, is crucial for early Heidegger. It concretizes our existence, pulls us out of the dispersed concerns of the everyday, Das Man, and opens us to the meaning of being. Saul Bellow's character Herzog captures this powerfully when he reflects death is God, highlighting that nothing faithful, vulnerable, fragile can be durable in the face of mortality. This unifying power of our personal mortality gives our lives immense humanistic significance, focusing our scattered concerns onto what truly matters. The insight. Facing your own mortality isn't meant to be morbid, it's a powerful clarifier. Recognizing that your time is finite can cut through trivial distractions and help you prioritize what truly makes your life uniquely meaningful for you. Now, theistic existentialists like Gabriel Marcel and Karl Jaspers offer a different perspective on humanism compared to atheists like Sartre and Nietzsche. While the atheists often claim freedom is absolute and that any human perfections attributed to God are gained at humanity's expense, we project our best qualities onto God, theists argue the opposite. They suggest that atheism ultimately degrades humans, reducing us to mere products of nature, accidental collocations of atoms. For them, freedom is genuine but created. Life is a gift, an invitation calling for a loving response.
Gabriel Marcel, for instance, advocated creative fidelity, a faithful creative response to this gift of existence. He strongly rejected the idolatry of the technical world, the reduction of everything to problems to be solved. And in stark contrast to Camus's ultimate hopelessness, Marcel focused on human hope. But it's a hope tied to faithfulness and confidence in an other's promise, not based on calculable guarantees. He insisted the only genuine hope is hope in what does not depend on ourselves, pointing towards a transcendent dimension.
Karl Jaspers developed something similar he called philosophical faith, which he distinguished from both revealed religion and atheism. It's an attitude towards what he called transcendence, an absolute other, the ultimate ground of our individual existence. This transcendence is revealed, he thought, particularly in limit situations, experiences like suffering, guilt, struggle, and facing death. Like Heidegger, Jaspers believed transcendence shows itself only to existence, emphasizing our unique human capacity to ponder our own existence and its limits. And this directly raises the crucial existentialist issue of contingency.
Right, contingency. The sheer brute fact that we exist, but we don't have to exist. Sartre's novel Nausea describes his character Will Kenton's profound, almost sickening experience of this. Looking at a tree root, he feels its existence, and his own, as utterly superfluous just there, without reason or necessity. Atheists like Sartre tend to see contingency as just a brute, perhaps absurd fact. But Marcel, on the contrary, experiences this same contingency not as lack, but as a marvelous superabundance of being, reflecting an almost Platonic principle of diffusive goodness. The response to that fundamental question, why is there anything at all rather than nothing, really distinguishes these different strands of existential humanism. The insight, how you confront the sheer, unchosen fact of your contingency fundamentally shapes your worldview. Do you see your being as an indifferent accident, Sartre, or as an unmerited, abundant gift, Marcel? This perspective can profoundly affect your sense of gratitude, purpose, and how you engage with the world.
Maurice Merleau-Ponty brilliantly framed the whole battle over existentialism around humanism. He asked, essentially, what part freedom plays and whether we can allow it something without giving it everything. It's about finding the proper, balanced place for humans within the material and cultural world, avoiding philosophical extremes that either reduce us or inflate us unrealistically.
He argued against both the materialists, who reduce humans to just physical or social forces, ignoring consciousness, and what he called spiritualists, who see humans as disembodied minds, ignoring our fundamental situatedness and embodiment. Merleau-Ponty famously insisted, "I do not have a body, I am my body." He was really the philosopher of ambiguity, embracing the complex, interwoven, often messy nature of our existence.
For Merleau-Ponty, existence is that movement through which man is in the world and involves himself in a physical and social situation, which then becomes his point of view on the world. This directly counters classical philosophy's emphasis on knowledge, on pure thought, as our primary relation to the world. He insists, like Heidegger with Dasein, that we are in the world primarily through our bodies and our practical concerns, our ongoing projects.
Merleau-Ponty's really unique contribution, Flynn emphasizes, was his deep analysis of bodily being, the lived body, and the interworld of social existence. These were topics often downplayed, or at least less developed, by early Sartre. Merleau-Ponty's background in experimental psychology strongly informed this focus, distinguishing him from most other existentialists and enriching the understanding of our concrete embodied situatedness. The insight. Your body isn't just a vehicle for your mind, it's how you are in the world. It's your primary way of interacting, perceiving, expressing yourself. This means your physical presence, your gestures, your posture, even your gut feelings are profoundly meaningful expressions of your being, challenging the idea that only abstract thought truly matters. Okay, so moving on to authenticity. For nearly all existentialists, ethical considerations are absolutely paramount. Flynn mentioned Sartre describing Camus as someone who upheld moral fact against opportunistic Machiavellians. There's a strong moral core here.
Absolutely, and this connects to the famous philosophical problem often associated with David Hume. You can't logically derive an ought, an obligation, from an is, a mere statement of fact. A moral conclusion always requires a prior moral premise. So, to the question, why be moral? You can't offer a purely non-moral answer like it will make you happy, because that instrumentalizes morality, makes it a means to an end. The autonomy of the moral realm, a Kantian heritage, means morality is valued for its own sake.
Sartre, in his critiques, aimed to give the bourgeoisie a bad conscience, didn't he? Urging everyone to own up to our self-defining choices. It echoes Nietzsche's famous imperative, become what you are. Authenticity, then, is about living the truth about ourselves, about our human condition. It's a way of existing that emphasizes the how, the manner, the commitment, rather than just the what of our beliefs and actions. It's about self-constitution in light of our freedom, the insight. Authenticity isn't about being original or true to yourself in some superficial pop psychology way. It's about living in full awareness of your freedom and responsibility. This means confronting your own choices and admitting the truth of your situation, even when it's uncomfortable, rather than taking refuge in excuses or societal norms. Hashtag 4.2 essay. The origins and nature of authenticity.
Heidegger actually gave us the specific term authenticity, translating the German Eigentlichkeit, which means something like real, own, proper. He insisted, though, that it carried no moral significance for him. It was more about being true to one's own possibilities, aligning with one's finitude, regardless of conventional moral rules. Sartre, however, disagreed and borrowed the term, giving it a moral weight.
And similarly, Sartre claimed his concepts of good faith and bad faith, mauvaise foi, were initially ontological descriptions and not moral judgments. Yet they clearly lend themselves to moral uses, and it's hard to read them otherwise. Flynn suggests both authors were perhaps mistaken, or maybe just unwilling to admit the inherent moral dimensions of these foundational concepts in their work.
Right. Authenticity fundamentally stems from that core existentialist insight that humans exist in situation. We're always an ambiguous mix of facticity and transcendence. Facticity refers to the givens, our race, nationality, talents, maybe our past choices that now form part of our situation. Transcendence refers to the takens, how we relate to these givens, our capacity to reach beyond them, to interpret them, to choose our future. Merleau-Ponty, as we said, really highlighted this inherent ambiguity. Heidegger's threefold structure of ecstatic temporality is essential here again. The past is thrownness, our facticity, we're thrown into a world not of our making. The future as existence, are projecting towards possibilities, and the present as immersion, often falling into the everyday. The future as the possible is particularly crucial for authenticity.
We are fundamentally creatures of the possible, aren't we? Even someone trying to overcome addiction, Flynn notes, cannot avoid the specter of the future, the possibility of relapse or recovery. Anguish, in existentialist terms, is our profound awareness of the possible as the very locus of our freedom. It's like that dark humor example of a man falling from a skyscraper who shouts, "So far, so good," as he passes the 30th floor. He's tragically disregarding the rapidly diminishing possibilities that actually define his situation. The insight. You're always more than your circumstances. Your facticity, all the given things about you, is real, but your transcendence means you always have the capacity to relate to those givens, interpret them, and move beyond them through choice. You can always choose how you respond to what's happened, always shaping your future. Hashtag 4.3-2, bifocal consciousness and the nature of self-deception.
Crucial to Sartre's notion of our situation, and especially to his analysis of self-deception or bad faith, is his understanding of consciousness. He sees it as bifocal. It has a pre-reflective aspect. It's implicitly aware of itself while being explicitly aware of its object, like seeing a tree. And it has a reflective aspect when it takes itself as its own object, thinking about seeing the tree. This structure allows self-deception to occur without needing a Freudian unconscious, because the subject is always, at some level, implicitly aware of what it's doing, even when it reflectively denies it.
So this means we are aware of more than we know. Like the dieter reaching for that second piece of cake, they have a pre-reflective awareness, a kind of bodily comprehension of doing it, even as they might reflectively tell themselves they're not really breaking their diet. This underlying comprehension is the basis for our profound responsibility. It means, for Sartre, we are without excuse for our actions, even those we try to hide from ourselves through self-deception.
Exactly. And because humans are fundamentally in situation and our consciousness is this dynamic, ambiguous, non-coincident thing, we are not stable, timeless identities like a rock or a table. Our identity is either externally imposed, leading to one form of bad faith, or it's something that has to be constantly sustained by our ongoing self-defining existential project. We are always a work in progress, and denying this fluidity, this inherent non-coincidence with ourselves, is precisely what constitutes bad faith.
Bad faith, mauvaise foi, is such a core concept in Sartre. It's self-deception, fundamentally rooted in our flight, from the anguish, the anxiety that comes with recognizing our radical freedom. Heidegger's concept of fallenness, is quite similar, isn't it? That tendency to get lost in the average everyday, the chatter of the they, neglecting our unique potential and our openness to being, both point to this fundamental human tendency to avoid the full weight, the responsibility of our existence, the insight. Bad faith is the deliberate act of deceiving yourself about your own freedom and responsibility. It's when you convince yourself, I had no choice, or that's just how I am, to avoid the anxiety of genuine decision-making. Recognizing this pattern in yourself allows you to see where you might be making excuses and reclaim your agency.
And the paradox of bad faith is that it denies responsibility, often by clinging to facticity. That's just the way I am. Flynn notes this is particularly prevalent in oppressive societies where self-deception about structural injustices might be rampant. Sartre argues that whatever we may be, we are in the manner of not being it. Our consciousness is always ahead of or other than what it is at any given moment. This creates that crucial gap for freedom and responsibility. This gap is also the source of anguish. Anguish, for existentialists like Kierkegaard and Sartre, is specifically the awareness of one's own freedom, the sheer possibility of possibility like standing on a cliff and feeling the possibility of throwing oneself off. Fear, by contrast, has a definite object like the fear of falling off the cliff. Anguish is before oneself, before one's own radical freedom to choose, even terrifying possibilities. Sartre also described belief, interestingly, as relying on non-persuasive evidence as opposed to the self-evident intuition required for genuine knowledge. Bad faith, then, can be seen as the choice to be satisfied with insufficient evidence for something we want to believe about ourselves or the world, like falling in love and intentionally, albeit maybe pre-reflectively, overlooking clear contrary evidence about the person. It's a kind of spontaneous ordering of one's life around this chosen satisfaction. As Sartre memorably put it, one puts oneself in bad faith as one goes to sleep, and one is in bad faith as one dreams. It's a pervasive state. Hashtag 4.4. Two forms of bad faith.
Okay, so Sartre identifies two main forms of bad faith, both driven by this flight from the anguish of freedom. The first, and maybe the most common, is collapsing our transcendence, our possibility, our freedom, into our facticity, our given situation. This is where we deny our freedom by claiming that's just the way I am, or I had no choice. Deterministic theories, whether Marxist or Freudian or biological, can provide handy theoretical justifications for this, relieving the anguish by denying creative freedom. It's resigning yourself to a pre-laid-out fate, the exact opposite of Camus' defiant Sisyphus or Dylan Thomas's rage against the dying of the light.
A really vivid example Sartre gives of this collapsing of transcendence into facticity is the perfect waiter. He plays at being a waiter. His movements are studied, a bit too precise, his solicitousness almost exaggerated. He's enslaved himself to an image, allowing the expectations of others and the role itself to define his entire being. He dismisses any other behavior as inconceivable for him as a waiter. He is a waiter the way a stone is a stone, denying his freedom. But his consciousness, Sartre insists, makes such total identity impossible. Authenticity, by contrast, would mean continuously renewing the project of being a waiter, always knowing he could shed the apron, walk away, and choose something else. The insight. This form of bad faith is about letting external roles define you. Instead of actively deciding who you are, you let your job title, your social role, or others' expectations dictate your identity. Recognize when you're playing a part, rather than genuinely inhabiting your choices. Remember, you can always shed the apron and choose differently.
The second, maybe less common form of bad faith is the opposite. It discounts our facticity, our past, our concrete situation, living purely in the future as pure possibility, unencumbered by reality. This is the bad faith of the dreamer, right? Like James Thurber's character Walter Mitty fantasizing about heroism while living a mundane life, or the student who dreams of being a brilliant brain surgeon but constantly hits the snooze button instead of going to their morning chemistry class. They choose not to choose in the present, deceiving themselves by ignoring the concrete realities and actions needed to achieve their goals. The insight. This bad faith is about getting lost in fantasies of what could be while ignoring the concrete actions required now. It's subtle self-sabotage. The takeaway is to ground your aspirations in present action. Dreams only become real through committed, often mundane choices today.
Ultimately, both forms of bad faith insist on a falsehood. Either we are pure facticity, determined, or pure transcendence, unlimited possibility. The authentic person, for Sartre and others, accepts the challenge to live the truth about their condition, embracing the ambiguous, often uncomfortable mix of what is given and what they freely make of it.
So like becoming an individual, achieving authenticity isn't a given state. It's an ongoing achievement, a constant striving. It means realizing one's individuality, avoiding being just a face in the crowd or a cog in the machine. The inauthentic person lives as they command, passively accepting pre-assigned roles and values.
Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, again, lives a largely inauthentic life, defined by convention, until he's forced to confront his impending death. Heidegger views being unto death as our most proper possibility. Facing our mortal temporality resolutely helps funnel our scattered, everyday concerns into a profound realization of what it means to be uniquely and finitely. This resolute acceptance helps achieve authenticity. It's the opposite of Ivan Ilyich initially rejecting the syllogism of his own mortality because it didn't fit his conventional life. Sartre, while considering my death as ultimately unrealizable since it's beyond direct experience, similarly links authenticity to the unity of a life. But he achieves this unity through a pre-reflective, fundamental choice, with a capital C, or life-defining project. This underlying choice unifies all our smaller empirical choices, small c, and experiences, giving our lives a coherent meaning or direction, even if we're not always conscious of it.
Sartre even proposed this idea of existential psychoanalysis to uncover this fundamental choice. It would involve interpreting the empirical signs of a life recurring patterns, choices, desires, but without appealing to a Freudian unconscious. It assumes life has a narrative structure, and its unity depends on the sustained underlying adoption of certain core values or projects. Though, Flynn notes, Sartre admitted he hadn't yet found the Freud for this method, the insight. Your life isn't just random events, it's an ongoing narrative shaped by a fundamental choice you've implicitly made about how to live, what to value. Understanding this underlying project can bring clarity to your motivations and actions, helping you live more intentionally and authentically.
Sartre controversially argued in Being and Nothingness that our original fundamental choice is actually a futile pursuit of being consciously self-identical. We try to achieve the solid, unchanging being of the thing, to escape the burden of our freedom. This is an impossible ideal of divinity, being fully self-caused and self-identical, and thus an inherently inauthentic flight from freedom. We are condemned to be free, he famously wrote. Whatever we are in the manner of othering it. Our consciousness always transcends what it is, preventing that solid self-identity we might crave.
But Flynn points out that while such fundamental changes in our project are rare, Sartre's posthumously published notebooks for an ethics hints at the possibility of a radical conversion. A conversion towards authentic freedom, embracing contingency and responsibility rather than seeking that impossible self-identity. This reveals a potentially more positive side of existentialist ethics, moving beyond the somewhat bleak picture of alienated society in being and nothingness.
Now, this focus on authenticity might seem like it could be a cover for nihilism, right? If traditional ethical rules are suspended or questioned, what's left? Yet, as we've said, existentialists hold ethics as paramount. So what kind of ethics are we talking about? Flynn suggests it's often more about an ethical style than specific moral content or rules. There are no easy recipes for living authentically.
Right. Nietzsche urged us to make life a work of art. Sartre explicitly likened moral choice to creating art not subject to pre-given rules, but demanding internal coherence and responsibility. But Simone de Beauvoir, importantly, noted in The Ethics of Ambiguity that this doesn't preclude the possibility that individual freedoms can forge laws valid for all. She emphasized the importance of that universal absolute end which freedom itself is. Freedom becomes the core value.
Exactly. Freedom is the ultimate value, and authenticity is the primary virtue guiding its exercise. This isn't an empty freedom where anything goes, nor is it the constrained freedom dictated by societal norms or expectations. It's a kind of joyous, clear-eyed embrace of contingency, a willingness to weather nihilism by affirming life and creating meaning in the face of its apparent groundlessness.
And crucially, de Beauvoir argued that authentic freedom necessarily pursues an open future by extending itself through the freedom of others. She powerfully stated, "My freedom is enhanced, not diminished, when I work to expand the freedom of others. To passively accept or ignore the oppression of others is therefore fundamentally inauthentic." This gives existential authenticity a concrete social content. It moves beyond mere individual self-realization and demands engagement with the world. The insight. True authenticity isn't just about your individual journey. It demands that you actively work to foster the freedom of others. Engaging in social justice, advocating for the marginalized, dismantling oppression, these aren't external duties, but essential components of your own authentic existence. Okay, so after World War II, Sartre especially faced heavy criticism that existentialism was just bourgeois individualism, detached from social reality. His famous line from the play No Exit, Hell is Other People, probably didn't help that perception. Yet, as Flynn shows, existentialists were generally highly critical of bourgeois society. Its conformity, its obsession with material comfort, its aversion to risk and genuine passion.
Absolutely. We already mentioned Kierkegaard's attacks on Hegelian philosophy for prioritizing abstract concepts over lived experience. Life must be lived forwards. The established state church for its cultural, comfortable Christianity that compromised gospel values for profit and status, and the popular press for undermining individual truth and promoting shallow public opinion. He was ridiculed for these polemics, becoming the laughingstock of Copenhagen, but he stood by his convictions. He saw bourgeois morality as based on convenience, on police posters, prioritizing usefulness to the state, lacking any fervor for the great, or understanding the depths of being nothing at all before God. It was a superficial, conformist existence he despised.
And Nietzsche shared Kierkegaard's deep distrust of the herd and had a strong disdain for democracy as leveling mediocrity. Both, early on at least, focused primarily on individual formation, not large-scale societal transformation. Nietzsche systematically inverted conventional gospel values, seeing pity, for example, as demeaning rather than virtuous. Neither extensively addressed social responsibility beyond the individual's attitude or choices. Kierkegaard's preferred solution to social ills was fundamentally a change of heart rather than social upheaval. The insight. Existentialists challenge you to critically examine the unspoken norms and values of your own society. Do you passively accept success or happiness as defined by others, or do you actively carve out your own values? This means recognizing how easily comfort and conformity can lull us into inauthenticity and finding the courage to push back. Hashtag 5.2. Heidegger, Jaspers, and National Socialism.
Now, despite his focus on individualizing concepts like being unto death, Heidegger did recognize being with Mitsein as a fundamental structure of Dasein, of human existence. We are thrown, he argued, into a shared cultural world where we inevitably develop a they-self, Dasman, that conforms to public opinion. Tradition and collective destiny offer both limits and possibilities, shaping our shared historical existence.
But Heidegger, tragically and infamously, misread the Nazi Revolution, didn't he? He saw it, at least initially, as a potential path towards an authentic being with, an opportunity for educational reform, and a third option between Bolshevism and Anglo-American capitalism. Flynn suggests he was seduced by the sheer power of the movement. This disastrous political judgment led to intense later critiques that his philosophy, with its focus on the individual's relation to being, overlooks the crucial ethical demands of intersubjectivity and social justice.
By stark contrast, Karl Jaspers stood out as a courageous anti-Nazi. After the war, he published The Question of German Guilt in 1947. In it, he carefully distinguished 4 categories of guilt: criminal guilt, for specific crimes; political guilt, of citizens for state actions; moral guilt, personal failings of conscience; and significantly, metaphysical guilt. Metaphysical guilt, for Jaspers, refers to our co-responsibility for injustices occurring in the world of which one is aware and does not actively resist. This new sense of collective responsibility profoundly influenced Sartre and others grappling with the aftermath of the war.
Jaspers' experience with the Nazis and the horrifying reality of the atomic bomb reinforced his conviction that the end does not justify the means. Politics must be subordinate to ethics. He called for fundamentally changing ourselves, our characters, our moral political wills, not just reforming institutions. Gabriel Marcel echoed this deep concern, seeing humanity's newfound capability for mankind-wide suicide through technology as demanding a radical choice and a profound awakening of social conscience. The stakes have become global. The insight from Jaspers, his concept of metaphysical guilt, means that even if you're not directly involved in an injustice, your awareness creates a shared responsibility if you fail to resist. This challenges you to consider your role in the larger societal narrative and how your inaction might contribute to maintaining an unjust status quo.
Gabriel Marcel, who Flynn calls a neo-Socratic thinker for his conversational style, launched a trenchant critique in his book Man Against Mass Society. He saw the dangerous spirit of abstraction at work in modern life, in war, demonizing the enemy, launching missiles without witnessing consequences, in bureaucracy, and in the fanaticism of the masses, who he felt were often trained, but not educated, susceptible to propaganda. He sought a return to concrete thinking, valuing the individual's lived experience over impersonal systems.
Marcel argued for specific social and political steps to free people from this dehumanizing mass condition. His solution was fundamentally communitarian. He favored strengthening intermediate groups like families, local communities, professional associations, maybe reminiscent of ancient guilds to mediate the power of the centralized state and foster genuine communion. Communion for him meant mutual respect and presence among group members, a direct person-to-person connection. This remarkably echoes Sartre's later concept of fraternity, emphasizing direct, humanized social bonds over abstract allegiances.
Marcel believed liberation requires moving from abstract categories back to concrete thinking, recognizing that humans are always in situation, unique individuals. Fostering an openness to the transcendent, to mystery, to what cannot be technically mastered was also key for him. He felt this curbs the totalitarian impulse and dogmatism that thrives on abstraction. It aligns with Jasper's view of protecting intrinsic human worth against forces that seek to reduce it, the insight. Marcel reminds us to resist the spirit of abstraction, reducing complex people to simple labels, statistics, or enemies. By focusing on concrete, face-to-face interactions and fostering genuine communion in our communities and groups, we can build relationships that push back against the alienating tendencies of mass society. Hashtag 5.4, Sartre and Camus on the Algerian War.
Sartre famously claimed his WWII experience in the French Resistance led to his discovery of society and propelled his deep political involvement, generally moving towards the left. Flynn describes him as a kind of political anarchist at heart, someone who saw authority itself as the other in us, always suspicious of established power, but also a committed moralist who imbued his political actions with ethical weight.
Merleau-Ponty insightfully noted that Sartre tended to focus on concrete acts of oppression rather than abstract structures alone. He saw social structures, like colonialism, as a kind of sedimentation of prior actions that were sustained by current choices and actions. So even though colonialism was a system, it still involved concrete meanness in its exploitative structure and its oppressive practices, demanding accountability from the individuals who perpetuated it.
Sartre's strong public support for the Algerian Revolution against French colonial rule, which led to bomb attacks against his apartment, clashed fiercely with Albert Camus. Camus, himself an Algerian-born French journalist, a pied noir, advocated for moderation, suggesting a kind of federation as a compromise between the status quo and full revolution. Sartre, however, adopted what Flynn calls an amoral realism in politics, leading him to support revolution wherever he deemed it necessary to overthrow oppression, even if it involved violence.
The very public, harsh savaging of Camus' book The Rebel by Sartre's associate Francis Jensen effectively ended their famous friendship. Sartre, it seems, prioritized political commitment over personal friendships at times, eventually aligning himself with radical Maoists by 1968. While Camus' reputation has perhaps been polished over time, the episode vividly highlights the intense political commitment and the painful divisions that characterized French intellectual life during the Cold War era. The insight. Even among thinkers deeply committed to freedom, there can be profound, irreconcilable disagreements on the most ethical path forward in complex political situations. This reminds us that making the right choice in social matters is rarely straightforward. It often involves navigating uncomfortable ethical dilemmas and potentially sacrificing personal relationships for what one believes is a greater cause. Hashtag 5.5, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty on the Communist Party.
Right after the war, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and Simone de Beauvoir founded the influential journal Les Temps Modernes, Modern Times. It was explicitly left-leaning. Sartre's introduction laid out their commitment: individual autonomy, rights, solidarity, and critically, expanding the concrete possibilities of choice for everyone. It was a manifesto for socially engaged existentialism.
Merleau-Ponty, initially quite sympathetic to Marxism, even defended the violence he saw as necessary for establishing and maintaining a communist state in his book Humanism and Terror. Sartre would later use similar arguments regarding revolutionary violence, but their political break came definitively over the Korean War. Merleau-Ponty saw the Soviet intervention as clear imperialism. Sartre, however, while Merleau-Ponty was away, allowed the publication of an essay strongly critical of American involvement. Merleau-Ponty resigned from the journal's editorial board. He later rejected Soviet Marxism entirely in his book Adventures of the Dialectic, which included a particularly scathing critique of Sartre's politics. De Beauvoir responded in kind, defending Sartre.
These intense family feuds, as Flynn calls them, dramatically played out the broader tensions of the Cold War on a stage of French intellectual life. Existentialism, through these very public debates and dramatic intellectual clashes, had clearly come of age in terms of social consciousness. It was grappling directly with the most pressing political and ethical questions of its time: the insight. These intense debates show that philosophical ideas aren't just abstract. They have real-world political consequences and stakes. It encourages you to examine your own political allegiances and convictions, recognizing that even well-intentioned stances can lead to stark divisions and difficult ethical compromises. Attack 5.6. Simone de Beauvoir and Existential Feminism.
Simone de Beauvoir's monumental work, The Second Sex, published in 1949, was a truly groundbreaking application of the core existentialist thesis that human reality exists in situation to the specific question of gender. In its most famous and revolutionary phrase, she writes, "One is not born a woman, one becomes one." She powerfully asserted that while biological sex is a given, gender is fundamentally a social construction.
She launched a devastating critique of the pervasive myth of the eternal feminine. That idea, found everywhere from Goethe's Faust to popular culture, of a timeless, passive, pure essence of womanhood. De Beauvoir argued this myth completely ignored the concrete situations, the lived realities of actual women. And more fundamentally, it was false because, for humans, existence precedes essence. There is no pre-given feminine essence. It was a powerful call to move from abstract, essentialist ontology to concrete sociology and politics, to understand and change women's lived reality.
De Beauvoir argued forcefully that what is socially constructed can, therefore, be socially dismantled. Her book is a profound attack on patriarchal power structures that define women as the other relative to men, and a rallying cry to dismantle those structures. It emphasizes that liberation requires both fundamental socioeconomic change and the active cooperation and choices of free individual agents.
Like Sartre on colonialism, she recognized the force of circumstance, things like public opinion, custom, economic constraints, as a real influence on women's lives. She enriched the understanding of individual action by showing how it operates within these structures without dissolving freedom entirely. Flynn sees this as existentialism meets Marxism and tries to humanize it, acknowledging structural influences while fiercely upholding individual agency and responsibility. The insight. De Beauvoir's work fundamentally shifts how we understand identity. If one is not born a woman, one becomes one. Then your identity, including aspects like gender, isn't a fixed essence you discover, but an ongoing process shaped by society and, crucially, by your own choices in response to that society. This empowers you to challenge traditional roles and actively define yourself.
De Beauvoir concluded The Second Sex with a vision of a disalienated, oppression-free society. This requires not just socioeconomic change, she argued, but also the conscious cooperation of free agents. She envisioned a future where men and women unequivocally affirm their brotherhood, using the term inclusively aligning perfectly with Sartre's concept of fraternity and a shared commitment to universal liberty. So it's abundantly clear that the major existentialist thinkers were not detached ivory tower intellectuals. They were deeply engaged with the political and social crises of their times. They sought to turn inevitable involvement into existential choice, as Sartre famously put it, reflecting on the French resistance during the Nazi occupation. We were never so free as under the occupation because every choice carried ultimate weight.
And what's fascinating is how the movement, especially later, Sartre and Merleau-Ponty, tried to grapple with the force of circumstance, with social structures, while still preserving that core commitment to individual freedom and responsibility. Sartre's search for a method asserted there are only individuals and real relations among them. And his massive difficult work, Critique of Dialectical Reason, elaborated how groups and institutions arise from and surpass individual actions, without necessarily destroying individual freedom, though they could either enrich or compromise it.
Merleau-Ponty encapsulated this nuanced, realistic optimism of social existentialism beautifully. He wrote, "The human world is an open or unfinished system. The same radical contingency which threatens it with discord also rescues it from the inevitability of disorder, providing only that one remembers its various machineries are actually men and tries to maintain and expand man's relations to man." That's a profoundly hopeful message, isn't it? It acknowledges the contingency, the risk, but also the potential for connection and positive change. The insight. Even within complex social systems and structures, individual agency and connection remain paramount. The world is unfinished, meaning our collective actions always have the potential to reshape it for better or worse. This calls you to remember that every institution, every system is ultimately made up of individuals relating to each other, and your efforts to improve man's relations to man, to foster understanding, justice, and freedom can genuinely make a difference.
Okay, so while the peak pop culture moment of existentialism, the black turtlenecks, the Parisian cafes certainly passed after WWII, its spirit arguably lived on, didn't it? maybe in various nonconformist movements, perhaps flaming out somewhat in the utopian slogans of the May 1968 protests in Paris, like all power to the imagination. That seems rooted in our nature as creatures of the possible.
Absolutely. For Sartre, art transcendence is fundamentally our imaging consciousness, our ability to reach beyond the actual towards the possible. The imaginary isn't just escapism. It expresses this fundamental freedom, but it's a committed freedom. The ideal society, for Sartre, sometimes called the city of ends, where relationships are egalitarian, non-objectifying, serves as a kind of ethical model for social interaction. He even saw its prototype in the relationship between an artist and their public, a kind of reciprocal gift appeal. As a philosophical movement, existentialism's legacy endures. It continues to defend individual freedom, responsibility, and authenticity against the forces of determinism, conformism, and self-deception, which are, let's face it, still very prevalent today. It uses art, literature, and powerful examples to make abstract principles concrete and lived. The insight. Existentialism reminds us that our imagination isn't just for fantasy, it's a powerful engine for freedom and social change. By envisioning what could be, by imagining different ways of relating to each other, we unlock our capacity for committed action to create a more just and authentic world.
Existentialism also took its own kind of linguistic turn, but different from the Anglo-American analytical tradition, right? Inspired more by figures like Saussure. It seems to prioritize lived experience, the German Erlebnis, the French le vécu as the groundwork, with language seen as expressing or perhaps fashioning this experience, rather than language rigidly dictating thought.
That's a good way to put it. Heidegger, for instance, often used philological arguments, analyzing the roots of words like existence to stand out, to try and reveal hidden truths about being embedded in ordinary language. He famously saw language as the house of being, but crucially, we are its guardians, not its prisoners. We shape language as it shapes us. Early Merleau-Ponty saw language primarily as expression, a form of bodily gesture, arguing that our lived bodies already possess a kind of intentionality before language. But his later encounter with Saussurean structural linguistics significantly modified his view.
Structuralism presented a major challenge, didn't it? It studies language as impersonal, necessary structures, Saussure, Lévi-Strauss, in anthropology. Signs get their meaning by differentiating from other signs, not by naming objects directly. Meaning becomes purely linguistic, internal to the system. This tends to decenter the subject, denying the individual's role in creating meaning, and is often seen as anti-humanist for that reason.
Right. Merleau-Ponty tried to integrate this structuralist insight without losing the individual. He came to see language as a system of differentiations through which the individual articulates his relation to the world. He made a crucial distinction between being determined by socioeconomic or linguistic structures and being motivated by them, preserving a space for freedom. His later concept of institution attempts to bridge structures and lived experience. Institutions are events or structures that endure, shaping experience, but they are also constantly modified and refashioned by ongoing experience, remaining open to the adventures of experience. It keeps agency alive within structure, the insight. Language doesn't just passively describe your reality, it actively shapes it. But you're not simply a puppet of linguistic rules. Recognizing this means you have the power to consciously choose your words, your narratives, not just to communicate facts, but to actively define your relationship to the world and influence how both you and others perceive it.
And Sartre, for his part, remained committed to freedom, proclaiming, "Freedom is the only possible foundation of the laws of language." He continued to see language primarily as expression, a basic technique for appropriating the world, where individual freedom extends even down to word choice. He tried to locate structuralist concepts within what he called the practico-inert field in his critique of dialectical reason, acknowledging structural causality while fiercely guarding the primacy of individual praxis, of free action.
This focus on meaning and lived experience naturally connects existentialism to hermeneutics, the theory and method of interpretation. Originally focused on interpreting texts like the Bible, hermeneutics expanded to include understanding any intentional act or expression. Thinkers like Dilthey and Weber used understanding, Verstehen, as the key method for the human sciences. Heidegger and his student Gadamer went further, seeing understanding not just as a method, but as our fundamental way of being in the world. Interpretation is constant.
Hermeneutics acknowledges that we always approach something with a prejudice or a pre-understanding, right? We're never a blank slate. This is what allows learning the famous hermeneutic circle, because we kind of both know and don't know simultaneously. Gadamer described the goal as letting what is alienated speak again, bridging the gap between our horizon and the horizon of the text or the other person.
Nietzsche pushed interpretation radically, insisting all knowledge was interpretation, denying the possibility of an ultimate non-interpreted text or reality. Truth, for him, was pragmatic. Knowledge is like treading water, always provisional. Heidegger made Husserl's phenomenology hermeneutical, arguing that we always have some vague inkling or pre-understanding of being even before we begin philosophical investigation.
Sartre similarly appealed to our pre-ontological comprehension of basic existential topics like freedom or consciousness. Philosophy's task is partly to bring this implicit awareness to reflective, thematic consciousness. His existential psychoanalysis is essentially a hermeneutic method interpreting the empirical signs of the basic choice to reveal the underlying life-defining project. This requires a kind of fusion of interpretive horizons between the analyst and the analysand, a shared understanding. The insight. All knowledge involves interpretation. You bring your own background, your pre-understanding to every situation. Recognizing this unavoidable bias is key to genuinely understanding others and learning new things. True listening and engagement aren't about finding the one objective truth, but about skillfully navigating different interpretations to build shared meaning and deeper understanding.
Though Heidegger saw understanding as universal, Sartre, characteristically, retained a place for traditional analytical reason, especially in the natural sciences. He linked hermeneutics more closely to dialectical reason, acknowledging its limitations when ideology or false consciousness clouds the transparency between people, but still affirming its crucial role in human understanding. Hashtag 6.4, an ethics of responsibility in a fragmented world.
So, bringing this all together for today, in our seemingly fragmented, maybe postmodern world, maintaining ethical identity and consistency is incredibly challenging, isn't it? Existentialists like Heidegger and Sartre sought unity not in some fixed substantial identity, but through the coherence of a resolute project or fundamental choice. Responsibility, for Sartre especially, is everywhere, unavoidable.
Thinkers influenced by existentialism, like Emmanuel Levinas, strongly rejected traditional metaphysical ethics. Levinas focused instead on an ethics of responsibility derived directly from the concrete face-to-face encounter with the other. Justice, for him, arises from the need to adjudicate claims when a third party enters the picture. This focus on irreducible responsibility resonated strongly with postmodern thinkers. Even someone like Derrida seemed to find justice undeconstructible, suggesting an ethical core that resists ultimate questioning.
Existentialism's core emphasis on being in situation offers real practical help here by championing concrete thinking over abstract rules. Flynn draws a parallel to Aristotle's distinction between universal justice and situational fairness, equity, and his ideal of the prudent person, phronimos. The phronimos is the person with practical wisdom who knows intuitively the right thing to do at the right time in the right circumstance. It's a kind of situation conscience, the insight. In our complex world, there's rarely a single universal right answer that fits every situation. Existentialism, echoing Aristotle, calls you to cultivate situation conscience, the ability to discern the most ethical path forward in your specific context, making creative, responsible decisions rather than just blindly following rigid rules. This means trusting your judgment and being prepared to invent solutions when necessary.
The existentialist, like Aristotle's prudent person, judges in situation. But there's a key difference, Flynn highlights, where the prudent person arguably discovers the right thing to do, already latent in the situation. The existentialist, especially for Sartre, decides or invents what is right through their creative choice. They legislate value. The authentic individual acknowledges their fallibility, the lack of absolute guarantees. But having made a choice based on the available evidence, aiming to promote freedom, they will make it the right choice by their follow-through, by taking responsibility for its consequences.
Existentialism, then, seems to offer a valuable bridge. It connects modernism's lingering hope for resolving ethical conflicts through reason or shared values with postmodernism's embrace of ambiguity and non-resolvability. It offers both the power of an ethical ideal, like Sartre's City of Ends, a community of mutual recognition, and the clear-eyed willingness to live with inevitable ambiguity, as thinkers like Merleau-Ponty and de Beauvoir powerfully proposed. It embraces both guiding principles and the inescapable messiness of real life. Hashtag outro. So we've taken quite a journey today through the rich philosophical landscape of existentialism. We've uncovered how these profound ideas from, Socrates all the way to Sartre, Kierkegaard to de Beauvoir really challenge us to think deeply about our individual existence and our place in this complex world. We've explored philosophy not as some dry, abstract theory, but as a dynamic way of living, that ancient care of the self that demands our constant engagement with freedom, with responsibility, and with the ongoing search for meaning.
Exactly. From that core idea, existence precedes essence, to the nuanced forms of authenticity and bad faith. From the subjective nature of truth and lived time to the crucial social dimensions of our freedom. Existentialism consistently insists that you are not just a passive observer of your life, but an active creator of its meaning. It's about recognizing the ambiguity, yes, the contingency, maybe even the sheer gift of being, and then leaning into those challenges rather than fleeing from them.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? It means that even in a world that often feels overwhelming, filled with information and external pressures, the core existentialist challenge remains potent. It's the challenge to embrace your freedom, to take responsibility for your choices, and as Nietzsche powerfully urged, to become what you are, which really means striving to live with authenticity in every moment and every choice.
And here's where it gets really interesting, maybe a final thought to leave you with. If authenticity isn't a state you achieve, but rather this ongoing, courageous act of claiming your own existence, how might your daily interactions, from the smallest decision you make today to the grandest ambition you hold for the future, be seen as a continuous, unfolding testament to the life you are actively creating right here, right now?